Welcome back to Learning Module 3. This week we're going to be going over Chapter 4, which is the shoulder girdle. Now let's look at what the shoulder girdle is made up of. It is made up of the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, and the clavicle, which most people call the collarbone. It moves as one unit. So whatever movements you do theoretically at the shoulder joint, the shoulder blade and the clavicle will move with moving that glenoid fossa, where the bone is, where the humeral head fits into it, the socket. It will move. The shoulder blade has to move to position this socket for the humeral head, so we can make the most efficient movements possible. Now the clavicle's articulation with the sternum is the only bony link to the axial skeleton. In other words, this is the axis of rotation for this particular system. And the shoulder girdle is considered a system of the body. Some texts also include the humerus, but in this particular text, they talked about just the clavicle and the shoulder blade. Now let's look at some key bony landmarks. The manubrium, which is, if we look at the breastbone here, it's the very top part of the entire breastbone. That is where the clavicle inserts at. That's the key or primary axis of rotation for the shoulder girdle. Clavicle itself, which is the collarbone. The coracoid process. So if we're looking at the front part, if we're looking at Mr. Bones here, if we look at where the scapula is, if we look at the front part, the coracoid process is this process that sticks out in the very front of it, and the anterior side. The acromion process, which is the end of the scapular spine, it's the uppermost process. The glenoid fossa, which is the actual socket for the shoulder blade itself, that's where the humeral head will articulate in. It's a very shallow socket, which causes the great range of motion for this particular system. The lateral border, which means the outside border. Here, if we look at it from this way, it's the outside border. The inferior angle, which is the very lower angle, the very bottom of the scapula. Then we have the medial border. That's the border that faces toward the midline of the body, or the vertebral column. Then we have the spine of the scapula. So we remember we talked about the acromion process. Well, the spine is this protrusion that sticks out on the superior part of the scapula. Now, the shoulder girdle itself, it moves moves in parallel with the thorax. Remember, we have the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. So it moves along the thoracic region, but it moves in parallel with it. And this is what we call scapulothoracic rhythm. Scapula moves on the rib cage, in parallel with the rib cage. Now, the joint motion occurs at the sternoclavicular joint. Remember, that's the primary joint for this entire system. And to a lesser amount at the acromion, the AC joint, acromion clavicular joint, which is where we have the acromion process, and the clavicle itself will meet right there, and that's considered a separate joint. So we have movement at the SC joint, lesser motion at the AC joint, but when this moves, the whole scapula move, and that's what they call scapulothoracic rhythm. Let's continue on with the joints. We talked about the SC joint. It's multi-axial, which it means it moves in all three planes of motion. If in relationship to manubrium, the clavicle moves anterior. In other words, the clavicle, when it's attached to this joint here, will move forward 15 degrees. That's where if we had protraction, we were reaching out for something or trying to push our arms forward. the scapula would protract forward. It would abduct and protract forward. But remember, the axis of rotation is at the SC joint. Now, it also moves 15 degrees in retraction. So if we're in the normal anatomical position, whether palms are facing forward or the palms are facing toward the body, as in normal human posture and stance, if we pull the shoulder blades together, this joint here will move, the clavicle at that joint will move 15 degrees to the rear in retraction. Superiorly, when we're raising the shoulder blade up, we're moving our arms up, or doing any kind of motions that makes the scapula move, it elevates and moves upward and outward, it will move 45 degrees with elevation. Now it moves inferior degrees with depression. So if we're in this position and we pull our shoulder blades down, it's only going to move about 5 degrees. So if we're in that anatomical position, we raise it up and superiorly with elevation, it's going to move 45 degrees. Then we go back to a normal stance. Then we try to depress the shoulder blade, push it down. It's only going to move about 5 degrees inferiorly. Now there are some slight gliding movements here. So it's going to roll just a little bit when that joint moves up and down, forward and backwards, but can also rotate a little bit there. So it's going to roll just slightly. Continue on. Let's look at the ligament support we have there. Now, anteriorly, we have the anterior SC ligament, which, if we look here, it's on the very front side of this particular joint. Now, posteriorly, we have the posterior, means to the rear, sternoclavicular ligament on the back side. Now, the costoclavicular interclavicular ligaments provide stability against superior displacement. In other words, it's not going to go upward. And if we look at the diagram here, we have the interclavicular ligament and the anterior sternoclavicular ligament as well. And the costoclavicular, if you look at these two here, it's going to hold it together on the front side, the back side, in between both clavicles, and in between here as well. The AC joint, acromioclavicular joint, it's an arthroidal classification. It has 20 to 30 degrees total gliding and rotation. In other words, it'll glide on each other, and it has some kind of rotational movement as well. Because if we look at that movement there, doing any kind of movement, front, back, up and down, or rotating our arm, it's got to move in that. It's going to glide back and forth, and it's also going to rotate a little bit too, depending on what type of movement we're doing. And it's supported by the coracoclavicular ligaments, the conoid and trapezoid. So if you look at where it's attached at, so if we have the scapula and the clavicle that are right there, it's in between the clavicle and the coronoid process. So it's right in through here. Those two ligaments, the trapezoid ligament and a conoid ligament. Now we also have the superior acromioclavicular ligament as well. And that's right on top of the joint where the two bones meet, where the acromial process meet together and the distal end of the clavicle will meet. We also have the inferior right below there. So we have the superior and inferior acromioclavicular ligament. That helps with the stabilization, helps bone to bone. And this is what's often injured. So we don't get a lot of injuries there, but we do get a lot here based on the movement patterns that most people have forward motion of the shoulders. We don't have a lot to the rear, but we have a lot forward, and that get injured quite a bit. Now let's look at scapulothoracic. It's not a true synovial joint. It does not have regular synovial features as we saw. And the movement depends on the SC and the AC joints, which allows the scapula to move, whether it's elevating, depressing, protraction, retraction, upward rotation, downward rotation. Remember, the scapulothoracic joint moves right along the rib cage and in parallel with the thorax. 25 degrees abduction, adduction. 60 degrees upward rotation and downward rotation. And 55 degrees elevation, depression. It's supported dynamically by all the muscles that attach to the scapula. There's no ligament support at all. Most of those muscles are attached just right to the bone. Now, we'll talk about the movement, so we're going to focus on specific bony landmarks. We're going to look at the inferior angle, which is the bottom part, the pointy part, the lower part of the scapula. The glenoid fossa, because that is the joint cavity which the humeral head will rotate in. That's the socket. We're going to look at the acromion process. I mean, that's the top process up front, the protrusion. Now, all these moves have a common pivotal point, and that's all at the SC joint. No movement can happen unless it rotates through here. Because remember, it's all one unit. It is a system. The shoulder girdle is considered a system. Now, let's look at this. Movements, shoulder girdle movements equal scapula movements. Remember that. Because remember, in order to move the arm, if you want to move the shoulder, it's all attached. The arm is attached to the shoulder girdle. So if you get movement there, you're going to get shoulder girdle movements, and that means the scapula has to move. Wherever the scapula goes, the clavicle follows, and vice versa. So these two go hand in hand. Now let's look at abduction or protraction. Remember, abduction is away from the midline. The scapula moves laterally away from the spinal column. So if you look at this picture there, the scapula moves away. Here is retraction. Here is protraction or abduction, moving away from the midline. Now abduction, we just said, retracting. Scapula moves medially toward the spinal column. So we have abduction or protraction, retraction or adduction, adding to the midline. Downward rotation, returning the inferior angle infero-medially toward the spinal column and glenoid fossa to its normal position. So if you look at it from this side, if the shoulder blade rotates upward and then downward, it's returning the inferior angle toward the spinal column and the glenoid fossa to its normal position. Upward rotation is just the opposite. Turning the glenoid fossa upward and away, move the inferior angle superiorly lateral away from the spinal column to assist in raising the arm. Remember, we're going to talk about this later, but you can do flexion of the arm without moving the shoulder blade, but when it gets past a certain angle, then the shoulder blade has to move to position that socket in the appropriate place. Same with abduction. Once you get past a certain point, the shoulder blade will move with that. For so many degrees here, the shoulder blade will move in correspondence with that to position that socket in the right place. Depression, downward or inferior movement of the scapula, moving it down as it returns it to normal position. Now elevation, we're going to raise our shoulder blades up, shrugging the shoulders, or moving it down, and then we could even actually depress it even more. If you look at a pull-up, when you're doing a pull-up, the first thing that's going to happen is to position the socket in the right place. When you first move is going to be depression of the shoulder blade downward. It's also going to retract. It's going to position that socket so all the load goes to the teres major and the latissimus dorsi to be able to pull the body upward. So we have depression and elevation. Now the shoulder joint and shoulder girdle, as we talked about, they work together in carrying out any kind of upper extremity actions. Shoulder girdle movement is not dependent upon the shoulder joint and its muscles. That's a whole separate system that controls that. We have muscles that control the shoulder joint, but as far as the scapula or the shoulder girdle, as the book states, they have its own set of muscles, and the shoulder joint has its own set of muscles. So if you look here, this lifter is pressing overhead. As she pushes up, she's in this position here. Now, depending on where her hands are at, her shoulder blades, she could be protracted forward if she's got her hands too close. But if she's in the right position here, her shoulder blades are going to be basically in a normal position. As she pushes overhead, what's going to happen? As she pushes upward, the shoulder blade, as it goes past 90 degrees there, the shoulder blade is going to move upward, and as she pushes back, it's going to retract, but it's going to rotate upward to position that bar overhead. Now we looked at these, the shoulder girdle muscles, they stabilize the scapula, so the shoulder joint muscles will have a stable base for which to exert force to move the humerus. So in some actions, like even just doing flexion of the arm, extension of the arm, all those muscles that are seen here to cause elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, upward rotation, downward rotation, are all going to work in unison together depending on what movement is happening here. They're all going to move together to stabilize this particular system. And they contract to maintain scapula in a relatively static position during shoulder joint actions. Once again, but it depends upon where the arm is at through its full range of motion. When we get to the shoulder joint, we're going to look at all those particular how much range of motion is at the shoulder joint, but also too when they work together, we're also going to look at the entire shoulder girdle range of motion and all the abduction, pressing overhead, protraction and retraction. We're going to look at all those ranges of motion. Now they're going to contract and move the shoulder girdle to enhance movement of the upper extremity, like we just said, when the shoulder goes through extreme ranges of motion. So we have to look at not only the shoulder joint, its range of motion, but the range of motion when the whole system is working together. Now let's look at some synergy with muscles like the glenohumeral joint. As we go through more extreme ranges of motion, the scapular muscles contract to move the shoulder girdle accordingly, so the glenoid fossa will be in a more appropriate position to which the humerus can move. That's what this thing is for. This whole system is for. Because remember, the socket is very shallow, so it's not built for stability, but in order to have that extensive range of motion, remember, if you look at the range of motion, it can be in a conical fashion here. You can do all kinds of things through various ranges of motion and various movement. It has to move this glenoid fossa attached to the shoulder girdle and the clavicle. It has to move accordingly to position the socket in the best, most efficient position to optimize the movement, optimize the position of this to maximize the effectiveness of that movement, and also to minimize the risk of injury. Without the accompanying scapular movement, the humerus can only be raised to approximately 90 degrees of total shoulder abduction and flexion. We can stabilize the shoulder joint, raise our arm up out to the side, and the shoulder blade doesn't move. It's the same thing here. If we're just doing it. So if you look at a bodybuilder, anybody doing abduction, adduction with a dumbbell, they're trying to isolate just that particular, those muscles that cause this movement. Same here. We line up the origin and insertion of the anterior deltoid muscles, so it causes flexion. But the shoulder blade is going to be in a stabilizing position, so we can just target that particular joint, what they call a single joint action. Same here. Now once we go here, the shoulder blade has to move accordingly to position that socket. Let's also look at some other synergistic muscles. This worked with the accompanying muscles on all the joints, working in synergy to accomplish the desired action of the upper body extremity. So let's look at overhead presses. to raise our hand out to the side laterally as high as possible, or to the front, or in this position here. We're going to have the serratus anterior, the lower part and upper part of the trapezius. Some books are going to call it the middle traps versus upper traps. And it's going to rotate the scapula and as the supraspinatus and deltoid, initiate the glenohumeral abduction. So let's look at that. Well, we're in this position here to press overhead or raise the arm up all the way. The middle fibers of the trapezius, or basically traps number 2, they're going to shorten. They're going to pull toward. Here's the origin. Here's the insertion. It's going to pull toward the spine, and it's what's going to happen. The shoulder blade is going to rotate. The lower fibers of the lower trapezius, traps number 4, is going to pull down. So it's going to cause downward. It's going to cause depression and rotation that way, upward rotation. But the serratus anterior is also going to pull in that inferior angle, so it's going to cause us to rotate upward as we go past a certain point. Once we get past 90 degrees there, all those muscles are going to work accordingly. The synergy between the scapula shoulder joint muscles enhances movement of the entire upper extremity. So as we get muscles that are trying to move the arm this way, once it gets past a certain point, those muscles at the shoulder joint are going to keep working, but it's also going to be facilitated by the muscles that attach to the scapula to move it upward to position the glenoid fossa in the right place. This is what they would call a force couple. Once again, shoulder girdle movements, we have elevation, we have depression. We have abduction or protraction. We have adduction or retraction, upward rotation of the shoulder blade, scapula, and downward rotation as we come down. 6 different movements. Now we also have 5 primary movements involved in shoulder girdle movements. They all originate on the axial skeleton and insert on the scapula or the clavicle. They do not attach to the humerus and do not cause shoulder joint action, what they said. We have muscles that move the humerus at the shoulder joint, but we also have other muscles that just move the shoulder girdle and move it at this particular joint, the SC joint. This is essential in providing dynamic stability of the scapula as it serves as a relative base for support for the shoulder joint activities, such as throwing, batting, blocking, pushing, pulling movements. Scapular muscles. This is important in spinal posture because if those muscles aren't strong, they'll elongate. If they can't hold the shoulder blade in place, whether it's retraction or depression or just in that position, we're going to see we're going to see protraction of that or adduction. You see people with bad posture, they got tight anterior muscles and weak posterior muscles of the scapula. Forward shoulders due to scapular protractors and depressors become stronger and tighter as the retractors become weaker. So as we have these muscles that pull the shoulder blade forward, the ones that retract them are going to get weaker. We see this all the time, especially with kids with like the backpacks. They carry the backpack, people on computers all the time that sit all day long. We also see this with people in the gym that do a lot of pushing actions here, the mirror muscles as we call them, and don't work the opposite side of that joint. We see this with pull downs and pushing overhead movements, pulling down movements, pushing movements, but not enough retraction movements. We see this all the time. It's called an imbalance at the joints. This contributes to kyphosis this way. It's less functional position for the glenohumeral joint because if in this position we can have a relatively good starting point to have more efficient movements. We optimize the efficiency and maximize the effectiveness of whatever joint we're doing. But if it's pulled forward, it's going to limit the range of motion. Now, from all my experience, I see this a lot with a lot of athletes who have really bad kyphosis. They have protraction this way, the shoulder blades, they're pulled forward because their posterior muscles on the scapula or the shoulder girdle are very, very weak. So when they try to do anything overhead, when we do evaluations of them, especially when they're laying on the ground, as they try to push their low back down, all those muscles that pull the shoulder blade forward are going to be really tight, and they can't pull this way. It's because it's important to maintain lumbar lordosis and keep the head and trunk in a balanced position. But if you're like this, the head protrudes forward, shoulder blades protract, we get the kyphotic action at the upper back, and then a lot of times too, they can't maintain a lumbar curve, the normal curve in the spine. They can't do that. And then we get it worse when they really have this and they want to pull forward here, so you can see it's almost like a collapsing effect. Good posture also enhances easier inspiration, because if we're compressed, we can't take a deep breath. But when we're this way, the diaphragm can push down even more and our lungs can fill up. When they're compressed like that, they can't fill up adequately.